Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Good evening and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium for September 20th, 2019. And today I'll be discussing a topic that is very important, that is brought up quite a bit on the dissident right, on online reactionary circles, and really it's just something that is relevant to all people everywhere, at all times in history. And this is on the topic of finding a lifelong romantic partner or a lifelong partner in marriage, if the term romantic disturbs some people. Um, and so I was really inspired to take on this topic by Saved Lawrence, who frequents um, the Cana Society Discord server, who's a submod like myself, and we were talking a little bit about my own relationship, and he suggested that I give some pointers to men that are sort of in the same boat as me, in the same situation as me, but don't have the added benefit of the girlfriend, right? And he encouraged me to share a little bit of my experience and how this relates to courtship and preparing for marriage, because I am one of the few men, it seems, in my age group that actually has one of these stable, chaste, courtly relationships that is, working towards becoming a marriage. So he suggested I isolate some points where I could give you guys some pointers, or maybe this is, not news to anybody. Frankly, I don't think I'm the most qualified person to talk about this, but I think maybe I can give some important insight for especially young men who are in my position. I'm sorry if I snivel, by the way, guys. I have a bit of a runny nose, allergies and whatnot. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guys sort of an overview of my position. So I have been dating a girl for about 2.5 years now, give or take, working on moving towards marriage. We're both in education right now. I'm supposed to be done in a year, and when that happens, it's most likely that we will perhaps find it fortuitous to um, have an engagement and to go through pre-Cana for marriage preparation. Um, but I've compiled a list of some things, or some notes on some things that maybe it's helpful for men who aren't in this position yet but will be eventually. And some of this stuff is not exactly things you didn't know, but things that maybe it's things that are commonsensical, but you didn't think about because you hadn't been in the position where it was necessary to think about it. So I've split up my notes into three particular categories. They are on dating and courtship, on courtship and habituated chastity, and on the goods of marriage. So I'm going to start on this question of dating and courtship. Now, there's always been a kind of frankly, somewhat uninteresting uh, distinction drawn between, dating and courtship. And while this is a good distinction, you definitely don't want to be quote unquote dating as we understand it in the modern world. I think a lot of the dating versus courtship conversation is based around a set of aesthetic principles that traditionalists and right-wingers associate with the term courtship, that aren't necessarily inherent to the thing itself. So what I would say courtship is courtship, rather than dating, is an explicit relationship between two people of the opposite sex, where it is made explicit by both parties that they are testing one another for compatibility for marriage, as opposed to dating, which, by the nature of dating, we mean two people who are together in a romantic relationship because of the pleasure that the relationship itself gives them. So this is the main distinguishing mark between courtship and dating. Now, a lot of people imagine courtship, like I said, very much in aesthetic terms. It conjures up images of the parasol walks in the park with a chaperone. And unfortunately, it's not the 1870s anymore, so this is not an accurate picture of courtship. As prudent as it is to have chaperones, for example, it is also necessary for a couple that is considering marriage to have time alone to talk to each other. Although it is worth pointing out that alone is not necessarily the same as without supervision. And so the main thing that distinguishes courtship from dating, as I said, is this intention towards marriage. And this is something actually that my girlfriend and I brought up. We broached the topic very early in our relationship because we wanted to make explicitly clear what the purpose of the relationship was. And I think this is something key, is that you don't want, obviously, you don't want to walk up to someone and say, hey, why don't we see if we're compatible to be married to each other? Quite frankly, it's a little bit creepy. You can think it, but don't vocalize that. But fairly early into the relationship, I think it was about 2 months, a month, 2 months. We were both thinking it, but we vocalized it, and it's good to have that sort of out in the open. And another thing that's good to have out in the open is, it's worth addressing power imbalances in relationships between men and women because this is an important component of courtly practice. Um, so men and women are different. They bring different things to a relationship. And men will generally be older than the women they date. This is or court or whatever it happens to be. Um, I, for example, am 3 years older, roughly 3 years, about 2.5 years older than my girlfriend. Men are going to have more resources. So even though I'm a man of modest means, I still have more money than my girlfriend, and this will hold to be generally true. And men will also have less incentive in a material sense, I suppose, to settle down with a stable partner. Men have more incentive to shop around and date than women do. Modern people think that the way to rectify this imbalance is to have women act like men. So, for women to make more money, for women to date men that are younger than them, for women to not seek a stable partnership. Um, and I think, as we can see with the modern dating scene, that is not working out for them particularly well. So I think, and of course, this is going to be a reoccurring theme with almost everything in your life, is that the proper tact here is actually for the man to embody Christian love and charity. So just as a wife is a kind of caretaker for her husband, I think this is pretty obvious if you've ever observed a happily married couple. The husband is a kind of caretaker for the wife as well. And so, what are the responsibilities that are inherent in this position? I could sit here and rattle off a list, but I think it kind of just boils down to treating her as an end in and of herself. And this goes for all other relationships in your life, not just romantic ones. And so, what do I mean by this? Um, well, you need to be asking yourself if your conduct is helping her to make free choices or if it's designed to be emotionally manipulative. So, for example, if, like this came up at one point, my girlfriend, she was under pressure from her family, who didn't necessarily trust me to begin with because I was in university at the time. I was 2 hours away, and I wasn't necessarily I hadn't necessarily proven myself to be trustworthy at this point, to not be engaging with other women in inappropriate ways. I wasn't, but they didn't have any proof of this. And so her family sort of pressured her to really consider the relationship and whether she could trust me. And so rather than me trying to pull on her heartstrings and say, well, I would never da 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 da. I just told her plainly what the truth was, and then I told her to make an informed decision, based on what she thinks is most prudent. And so I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that it's very easy, especially in the early stages of the relationship, to have the ability to tug on people's heartstrings, to have the ability to emotionally manipulate the other person in the relationship, and you have to resist that temptation. You have to ask yourself if you are bringing her to a deeper worship of God, or are you bringing her to a deeper worship of yourself or herself, like you're stoking her vanity. You always want the focus, you kind of always want the focus of your relationship to be turned outwards to the will of God, the things that God sees as appropriate in the relationship, and what you're striving for in a religious aspect. And you need to ask yourself if you're withholding. So if you are keeping in this chaste courtship, are you withholding from sinful advances because you want to be perceived as good either by her or her family, or what the case may be? Or do you really want to practice the good? And if it's not the latter, then there is some soul searching that you need to be doing. Because you need to remember that women are not impervious to manipulation, especially by men that they love and trust. A man does not hold his prospective wife as an object of Christian charity. If he does not do so, he will be tempted to make her an instrument of his own passion. Not necessarily sexual, but often. So you could think of a case where this might not necessarily be sexual. For example, if she's a particularly good cook and all you seek to gain out of the relationship is gustatory pleasure, then you might use her as an instrument to her, fantastic home cooked meals or whatever. And that's benign, or it's more benign than certainly trying to manipulate her out of her virtue, but it is still a kind of manipulation. So this all circles back to the point of, if you cannot see her first and foremost as a person with God given agency, then you're not courting someone. You're emotionally shanghaiing someone. You're tricking them in a sense. And so that's why I would always keep in mind that the way that you need to approach the person that you're in a relationship with is always with Christian charity. So the next topic I wanted to talk about is chastity in the domain of these relationships. So I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about my own circumstances. The year 2017 was kind of a whirlwind time for me. So I went from a previous relationship that was profligate it into a physically chaste one, into the one I'm in now. And furthermore, I went into the bosom of the church. This was the year that I entered the church. And I went from someone who was used to getting sexual gratification quite often to someone who had not done so in a little over 2 years. So at the time that I'm recording this, it's been a little over 2 years since I've indulged this appetite in any way, shape, or form. And this is not a great feat on my part. This is a working of the graces of God that have brought me to this point. And so I think while it's obvious, it's worth saying that you should not engage in a relationship with a woman if you have problems with serious problems with chastity, and one of these is an addiction to pornography. This is engaging in a relationship with a woman while you have this addiction is the equivalent, although it's objectively more pathetic, of entering into a courtship with a woman but spending your free time at a brothel. And no woman should be expected to tolerate this or put up with it. And if you're looking for a woman in the right place, they are definitely not going to tolerate this. So I guess that does make it easier for you in some sense. In my personal experience, I had something of the character of a road to Damascus type conversion. Not in the sense that I was knocked off my horse, saw an apparition or whatever, just in the sense that I was sort of shocked all at one time into action that eventually brought me into the church and brought me back to God. And this is not most people's experience, I think. So for most people, overcoming these vices will require the same willpower as something like, say, quitting smoking cold turkey, and probably more so. Now, I've done both, and I could say that the former was definitely harder than, say, quitting smoking cold turkey. It was both were hard, but one was definitely harder. And like I said, I'm not giving myself credit for any of these things. I'm giving God credit because it was the workings of Christ through me that brought me to this point. And without that, I don't think I would be here making this video, giving this kind of advice. And the reason for that really is just when you're filled with holy things, you're more and more repelled by immorality. And this is the way that virtue is habituated. Where at first you had an aversion to the holy and a propensity towards the sinful, if you're cooperating with God's grace in your life and habituating virtue, then the relationship will be inverted, and you'll have an aversion to the sinful and a propensity towards the holy. This is what habituation means. This is why habits are so important. And so if you take this and you apply this to your relationships, when you're dealing with the opposite sex in ways that are chaste and commendable, this helps develop the virtue of chastity in both partners. And this is something that is absolutely necessary for a relationship that is focused on God, and for a relationship where both partners are respecting each other as persons, as is proper to the natural order of marriage. Thus, courtship, in a way, it can be an opportunity to grow in this virtue. But if you enter the relationship already broken, so if you enter a relationship where you're in mortal sin and you're cut off from God's graces, you will be more likely to drag your partner down with you rather than be lifted up to their level. In a way, this is very similar to the church's, I think, very just warnings against Catholics marrying non-Catholics. Not that non-Catholics can't be good holy people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are different stages in spirituality, and it's much more likely that someone at the lower end of spirituality, or somebody who is in a more, we'll go with that, a lower form of spirituality will bring the other person down to their level, to the lowest common denominator. So that's just something that's helpful to remember. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the goods of marriage itself. So St. Augustine tells us that the goods of marriage are permanence, fidelity, and openness to offspring. So he wrote this in De Bono Conjugale. That's a word right there. And I want to close this video in remarking on ways in which relationships can aim towards these goods. So the first is permanence. In the modern world, everything is in flux. Markets, political structures, people's genders, apparently, and especially interpersonal relationships. This is not natural to man. In fact, it does human beings great harm to be in these relationships. And I know this speaking as someone who is the product of a family that has now had 2 generations of multiple failed marriages. My grandmother, for example, was married twice. My dad's been married technically 3 times. And it has not helped cohesion. It's not helped the family psychologically, financially, spiritually. It has been nothing but a detriment to all members of the family. And so people require a home and a haven. They require somewhere where they can rest their hearts. And this is the good of the permanence and indissolubility of marriage. And so this being the case, one needs to take steps towards preserving a marriage for life before it is even contracted. Because remember that marriage is not one person, you, adding body mass to yourself. Rather, it's 2 people becoming a union of one with 2 minds. And those 2 minds have to align. They have to be going in the same direction, or else they will pull the body in opposite directions. Marriage is intended as a hedge against concupiscence, but 2 spouses aligned against one another will make their marriage a kind of concupiscence in and of itself. So, as I've stated before, the courtship period should focus on the goods of marriage, one of which, namely permanence, and how we're going to bring this about. And unfortunately, that may require very painful things of you, like humility, self sacrifice, and denying your own pleasure. The next thing I want to talk about is fidelity. And so it's obvious that a covenant that lasts until death is pointless if one or both members continually break it. One of the ways that men can break their marriage covenant is by watching pornography. It does one's wife a grave dishonor to do that. Even when you're not technically married, even when you're courting, it's still you're doing her a grave dishonor. That's beside the point that you're mortally sinning. Another way that we can be deficient in fidelity is by placing worldly concerns before marital duties. And this is something that people do all the time, especially with work. Since marriage is a spiritual devotion, one must place it in the same respect in one's life as, for example, the missionary who preaches to foreign peoples. The missionary must be wholly devoted to his mission and not say, enriching himself by buying low at one port city and selling high in the next. If he has some kind of side racket going on, he's not really devoting himself wholly to his mission, and so he's not practicing his mission as perfectly as he could. Fidelity requires mutual love, mutual respect, and mutual submission. So if you had the idea that husbands were not supposed to submit to their wives, you obviously stopped reading that portion in Ephesians, just like every feminist does. Husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. That should elicit fear in you, frankly, because I think we all remember what Christ did for the church, right? Anyway, and the last point is openness to offspring. If you don't want kids, don't get married. Simple as. Marriage is not a lifelong agreement to live in the same house and have sex. That's merely a bizarre contract that one would draw up with a particularly strange prostitute. And this is actually something that my girlfriend and I have talked about a great deal. We are open to having children, but as you may know, the job market isn't exactly the best right now, so it will be difficult. And what we've thought about, what we have decided is that the goods of bringing more people into the world outweigh the potential tertiary goods that we could have enjoyed. For example, having two cars or having a nice expensive house or what have you. The goods of life itself. They do not outstrip the trappings that you put on your life. And so openness to children correlates very well with every other marker of a good marriage, I think, generally. Now, it is possible for someone to be open to children and not have these things, but implicit in the desire for children, implicit in the openness to life, is the rightly ordered desire in the valuing of persons as persons. And if you can get that down, which is the essence of love, of Christian charity, then I think you have a firm foundation to go on to acquire all the other virtues. So some closing thoughts before I go. A great woman will not smack you upside the head. It just won't happen. They won't, come careening out of thin air and just, first of all, they won't initiate, more likely than not, but second of all, it's very unlikely that there's going to be this I looked and then I knew moment. At the same time, if you're hunting around for a woman like a madman, it's going to be equally fruitless, because just that act of desperation in and of itself is going to close off the options that you really need, because you're placing this as too high of a good in your life. As a matter of fact, if you can't find a good marriage candidate, this may be, but is not in and of itself, a sign that you should enter the ministry or the priesthood. Now, entering the celibate life does not mean that you don't have to cultivate virtue. It means that you need to do it even harder. So you can't think of seminary as an easy way out, right? And another thing is that, vocations to the priesthood, it is not like God comes down from the clouds and tells you you need to be a priest. Some people will discern the priesthood forever and ever when, really, if you're in this situation and you are in this state where you're not you're not finding any good candidates for marriage, and maybe you do feel the tugging of your heart towards the fathership of the priesthood, that that should be an indication by itself that maybe it's a good idea for you to go ahead and take on that cross. That be your cross to take up. Maybe. Potentially. But like I said, that doesn't mean that this is some kind of easy out for guys that can't get women. That is not what it is. It's something far more important. It's something far more spiritually awake than that. And but don't eschew married life just because of that. Healthy churches are built on the backs of healthy families, and healthy families are built on the backs of healthy marriages. Another thing I can recommend is, don't be too blunt, right? Like I said, don't walk up to a woman and say, hey, I saw you and I was wondering if maybe we could talk about whether we could get married or not. That's weird. Don't do that. But be honest about your expectations for a relationship with a woman. If you've singled out a woman that you think you might like to court and you've talked to her for weeks, it might be a good idea to say, hey, by the way, I am looking for a partner for marriage, and if that's not your goal, then we should stop right now. Um, and not only that, not only about the purpose of the courtship, but just about things in your relationship in general. If there is a problem, you need to be honest about it. You need to bring it up. And if someone brings up a problem to you, you need to be honest about the ways maybe you contributed to such a problem. I mean, this all goes back to just good communication within relationships. None of the stuff that people tell you about how to be a good communicator, about how to have good relationships with other people, none of that is obsolete once you get into a romantic relationship. All of that, still has purchase. And always remember that marriage is not just about the marital act. If you're zeroing in on that, you're missing the plot, frankly. If you don't want to get, if you want to get married so you can have sinless sex, then you're in it for the wrong reason. And frankly, you are a spiritual danger to whoever you're in a relationship with. So I would say if that's what you're doing, get out. Go do some soul searching. Go, if you're like me and you find yourself in that kind of situation, you need to be taking the sacraments more regularly. You need to be intensifying your prayer life, and you need to be ordering your will more and more towards the good, not just conditional goods, but of real goods, the good itself. So there is a temptation for people to think, oh, I'll get married so I can have sex and not feel guilty about it. That is not the point. And the last thing is, remember that marriage as a good and courtship as a path to marriage should always be ordered to the worship of God. And this is the most important thing I can say about it. This has been the most important aspect of my relationship. And if you follow this precept, it will lead to better results than anything else I can tell you. So if you didn't take away anything else from this, take away that. At any rate, guys, this has been the Hidebound Convivium, signing off, and God bless.